You can close your eyes now. Let the days slip away, like sand falling quietly between your fingers. Breathe in slowly, and out again. Somewhere, far across the centuries, the Roman world is stirring. Marble villas glimmer in the evening light. The air smells faintly of olive oil, wine, and dust. And beneath that world of senators and soldiers, a quieter one breathes. A world built upon countless lives. Lives owned by others. Tonight, we drift softly into that world. Not with judgment or alarm, but with curiosity, gentle and steady. How far could Roman slave owners really go? What did it mean to be owned? To belong to another? And yet to wake each morning beneath the same sun? Let's wander slowly through the quiet corridors of Roman life. Through the kitchens, the workshops, and the gardens. And see what power really meant. In a world where one person could be another's property. And somewhere in the distance, a fountain keeps murmuring, its water echoing softly under the stars. The legal breath of ownership. In the Roman world, ownership was not a metaphor. It was law, cold and complete. The Latin word was dominium, meaning the absolute right of possession, and over slaves, it was almost without limit. To the Roman mind, a slave was not a person in the legal sense, but a thing, a res, like a piece of land or a cup. And yet, even within that framework, there were rhythms and boundaries, not of kindness perhaps, but of necessity. The state, pragmatic as always, saw slaves not just as objects but as investments. A dead slave, after all, could no longer labor, could no longer bring profit or prestige. Roman jurists, whose language still whispers through modern law, debated endlessly about the extent of this power. Could a master kill his slave? Yes, in theory, it was his right. But in practice, by the later Republic and early Empire, it began to sour the air. Senseless cruelty disturbed public order, and Rome prized its image of control above all things. By the time of Emperor Hadrian, the killing of a slave without cause could even lead to punishment, not because the act was unjust in moral terms, but because it was seen as wasteful and uncivilized. A reflection of bad mores, bad custom. Still, it was a strange kind of mercy. The law gave with one hand, and took with the other. Slaves could not marry legally, though many did in practice. They could not own property, though sometimes their masters allowed them to hold savings, called a peculium, a small purse of coins that, if fortune allowed, might one day buy their freedom. It was a world of fragile permissions. Nothing truly belonged to the enslaved. Even their laughter, their words, their silence, all of it was, in law, another's to command. And yet if you stood in a Roman street at dusk, and heard the low hum of voices spilling from the houses, you might never know who was free and who was not. The boundaries, in daily life, blurred. They were written more in fear and obligation than in sight. And somewhere, in a dim atrium, a lamp flickers over wax tablets and ink, as a slave records the accounts for a master too tired to notice his trembling hand. The household machine. A Roman household, or familia, was not simply a family. It was an economic machine, and at its heart were slaves. They cooked, they cleaned, they raised children who were not their own, and often not their masters either. They were artisans, scribes, secretaries, tutors, midwives, and musicians. They whispered in the ears of senators. They polished silver that was never theirs. In the large villas outside Rome, hundreds could serve under one roof, their duties arranged like the gears of a clock. The villicus, a kind of overseer, might control the estate's laborers, while the nutrix cared for infants in silk. And above them all, the dominus or domina, the master and mistress, moved like the sun, powerful, untouchable, yet utterly dependent on those who toiled beneath them. Even within slavery, hierarchies flourished. A house slave, trusted and literate, might look down on a field hand. A personal attendant might wear fine tunics and dine on table scraps richer than a free peasant's meal. This strange ladder of unfreedom created a society within a society. Each rung defined by proximity, not to liberty, but to the master's comfort. And when the evening came, and torches lit the marble corridors, the household fell into a quiet rhythm. Soft footsteps on mosaic floors, the hiss of oil lamps being trimmed, and the faint smell of bread cooling for morning. Discipline and fear. Power in the Roman household was both visible and invisible. Sometimes it took the shape of a whip or chain. Other times, it was just a silence that hung too long in the air. Roman masters believed in discipline as an art, a performance of authority, as much as a punishment. They read manuals that advised them to reward obedience and crush defiance swiftly. The Roman writer Cato the Elder kept lists, cold, practical, of how to manage slaves. He spoke of them as tools, to be used carefully but without sentiment. A slave should always fear his master, he wrote. Fear, he believed, kept the machine in motion. In the countryside, punishment could be brutal. Chains, branding, even execution were not unknown. A slave who ran away might be marked on the forehead with the letters FUG, for fugitivus, runaway. But within the walls of the city, discipline often took subtler forms. The removal of privileges, the withholding of food, the slow erosion of dignity. Yet even under such weight, life went on. People laughed, and found small joys. A forbidden song hummed under one's breath. A stolen sip of wine. A glance across the courtyard that meant freedom, if only for a heartbeat. And in some quiet room, a slave might whisper to another, "Tomorrow will be gentler." And somewhere, not far away, the hearth kept crackling, soft and slow. The peculium and dreams of freedom. Freedom, for a Roman slave, was not a right, nor even a hope encouraged. And yet, within the folds of Roman life, there was a small space, narrow, uncertain, where the dream of liberty could flicker quietly. It was called the peculium. The word itself sounds modest, almost soft, a little thing, a private purse of sorts. But to those who were enslaved, it was a doorway, invisible but real. The peculium was a sum of money or property that a master allowed a slave to manage. It did not legally belong to the slave, nothing truly did, yet it could be used, grown, traded, and if fortune smiled, saved. A slave who was clever, trusted, or industrious could, over the years, accumulate enough in this shadow economy to buy something that no law could easily measure, their freedom. The Romans, practical as always, did not forbid this. It made sense to them that a slave who managed his master's business might also manage his own affairs, under supervision. It kept ambition alive, a quiet incentive, humming beneath obedience. In the city of Rome, many house slaves worked not only for their masters but also on small side tasks, crafting shoes, brewing wine, copying documents. A portion of what they earned went back to the household. But the rest, the coins left glinting in the palm, could be tucked away into a secret box, a linen pouch, or the corner of a wooden chest. For some, those coins became a language of hope. There are fragments of letters, scratched in faded ink, from slaves who had nearly saved enough. They speak with trembling pride of buying themselves, or their children, or sometimes a lover still bound to another master. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was a legal ceremony, formal, sometimes public, and layered with ritual. It could take place in the forum, before a magistrate, or privately at home, witnessed by friends. The master would declare the slave free, liber esto, and with that phrase a new life began. But liberty was not simple. The newly freed person, called a libertus or liberta, carried invisible chains still. They owed loyalty, and sometimes labor, to their former master, now called their patron. They took on his family name, entered his social web, and often remained bound by expectation, if not by law. Still, for those who had known only ownership, it was a beginning. A Roman libertus might open a shop, run a tavern, or educate his children as free citizens. His name, once merely whispered, could be inscribed in stone. There are tombs, hundreds of them, that still stand along the Appian Way and other ancient roads. Their carved Latin inscriptions tell of men and women who had once been slaves but had bought their release. The words are proud, careful, and tender. I was a slave. Now I am free. I built this tomb with my own hands. And one imagines them standing there, gazing at their name newly chiseled. The stone cool under their fingertips. The air heavy with the smell of cypress and dust. Even in freedom, though, the shadow of the old life lingered. Many freedmen continued to work in the same households or businesses where they had been enslaved. Their freedom was legal, but not entirely emotional. The Roman world was built on networks of duty, invisible threads that held people in place. Still, a free morning felt different. To wake when one chose. To walk through the market without permission. To spend a coin one had earned. These were small miracles. Sometimes, the peculium passed from master to slave almost symbolically. A kind mistress might grant it as a gift, a reward for years of service. Other times, it was a long bargain, a contract quietly negotiated between fear and favor. Imagine it. A dim atrium. Light spilling through the open roof. A small table set with wax tablets and a bowl of coins. The master, in a soft linen tunic, watching with detached curiosity. The slave counting carefully his own worth. Each coin falling like a heartbeat. Soft, deliberate, final. In that moment, the law shifted, imperceptibly but completely. One life ceased to belong to another. Some masters freed slaves in their wills. Upon the reading, names were spoken, sometimes tearfully, sometimes indifferently, and chains, at least in law, vanished with the breath of the deceased. But others withheld it, choosing instead to bind loyalty tighter by hope, not by mercy. For women, the road was harder. A female slave might be freed as a concubine or companion, her independence shadowed by attachment. But even then, manumission could change the course of a family's future. A freedwoman's son might, in time, rise high enough in Roman society to own slaves himself, the wheel turning again, endlessly. The peculium was not just about money. It was a kind of quiet rebellion against fate. Each coin was a refusal to forget the self, a reminder that, beneath the law's cold language, a person still lived, still planned, still dreamed. Some slaves never reached freedom. They grew old, their savings absorbed back into the master's estate. But even so, they had carried the idea, that small, secret flame, through the years. And at night, when the household slept, and the city's noise faded into the hum of crickets and dogs, one could almost hear it. The faint clink of coins being counted in the dark. A quiet rhythm of hope, echoing through marble walls. And somewhere, in the garden outside, a fig tree rustled softly in the warm Roman wind. The slave markets and the first moments of ownership. Before a slave could dream of freedom, there was the day they first became property. It began not in the marble courtyards or the echoing halls of villas, but in the noise of the market. The Roman slave markets were not secret. They stood in the open, in the same spaces where vegetables were sold, where merchants haggled over oil and wool, where the scent of fish mixed with the sweetness of figs. To the Roman eye, this was simply commerce. One kind of life traded for another. The most famous of these markets was near the Forum Boreum, the cattle market by the Tiber River. There, under the shadow of temples and arches, stood rows of men, women, and children, displayed, inspected, and priced. Each was tagged with a small tablet around the neck, a placard called a titulus. It listed origins, skills, health, and temperament. A life summarized in a few carved lines. From Syria. Cook. Understands Greek. No defects. Or simply, good worker. Silent. The Roman buyer would circle, hands clasped behind his back, eyes moving as if over livestock. He could touch, test, question. Teeth were examined, arms prodded, back straightened. A slave who had survived capture, war, or debt now faced the theater of commerce, the final step of unmaking. Many were sold by traders who had purchased them from the provinces. From Gaul, Britannia, Thrace, Judea, Numidia. The empire's borders were long and restless, and human cargo flowed endlessly inward, like rivers feeding the city's appetite. Not all came by conquest. Some were victims of debt or punishment. Some abandoned children raised for sale. And others, born in captivity, had never known a day of ownership other than this. There were markets for every kind of buyer. The wealthy elite sought educated slaves, secretaries, tutors, accountants. The middling Romans wanted strong hands for kitchens, baths, or stables. And in the countryside, traders sold whole groups at once. Young men with the broad shoulders of future field laborers. Prices varied like the tides. A skilled scribe could cost the same as a small house. A laborer, the price of a horse. A child, less than a fine cloak. In the Forum, the air was thick with voices. Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Punic, all interwoven. Some pleaded softly for a fair master. Some stood silent, staring past the crowd. And some, numb from travel and hunger, simply waited for the day to end. The law offered certain rituals to soften the act, but they did little. A seller was supposed to disclose defects, illness, tendency to run away, or a rebellious spirit. Failure to do so could lead to restitution. But these were details of commerce, not of conscience. Once the transaction was done, the buyer took possession, mancipium. A symbolic touch, a verbal formula. And a life passed from one set of hands to another. It was, in the language of law, a transfer of thing to owner. But the thing could breathe, remember, and dream. The first hours of ownership were disorienting. A new name was often given, the old one shed like a husk. Inscriptions from tombs tell us how many of these names carried irony. Felix, meaning fortunate. Faustus, meaning lucky. Eutychus, meaning blessed. They were small masks, placed on the faces of those who had no choice but to wear them. Some buyers were merchants taking slaves to ships, bound for villas far from the city. Others led their new servants home that same day, through the crowded streets, where fountains spilled their steady music, and the smell of baking bread drifted through open doorways. For the newly purchased, Rome must have seemed endless, its streets winding like a maze, its noise a living thing. Stone, smoke, and voices pressed from every direction. They would soon learn the rhythm of this new life. The rise and fall of the household bell. The footsteps that summoned. The tone that warned. Yet within those first days, there were moments of stillness. Perhaps in the corner of a courtyard, as they watched sparrows flit between roof tiles. Or by the fountain, where the water caught the sunlight like liquid glass. Moments when the mind reached back to a mother's voice, to a field once green and open, to the sound of a different language fading like a dream. The Roman masters did not think of themselves as cruel, most of the time. They believed they were practicing order, not malice. The gods themselves, they said, had arranged the world in hierarchy. Masters above slaves, men above women, citizens above strangers. To question this was to question Rome itself. And so life continued, as it always does under the weight of habit. Each morning the city rose with the sound of carts and hoofbeats. The markets filled again. The buyers returned. And the cycle repeated. Voices, coins, contracts, silence. By night, the stalls stood empty. The tablets taken down. And the Tiber murmured softly in the dark. Somewhere, beyond the walls, a caravan moved by torchlight. New captives trudging toward the capital. Toward the same markets, the same stones. And in the far distance, the wind brushed across the 7 hills, carrying with it the faintest sound. A chain, a prayer. And the slow turning of empire. And as the city drifted into sleep, the fountains kept whispering, their water tracing gentle circles in the moonlight. The bonds between slaves. If you listen closely enough to any age, beneath its grand stories of conquest and marble, you can hear the softer sounds, the murmurs between those who endured it together. In Rome, those sounds belonged to the enslaved, though the law said they were property. Life insisted that they were people. And people, even in captivity, reach for one another. Within the walls of the villa. In kitchens that smelled of smoke and flour. In courtyards where washing lines hung like pale banners. Bonds began to form. Not official, not written, but real enough to outlast cruelty. And sometimes, even time itself. Slaves lived closely, sleeping in shared quarters or on straw by the hearth, eating from the same bowls, whispering the same fears. They were companions in fatigue, in punishment, in the strange rhythms of another's life. A household's enslaved people became a family of sorts, a fragile one, stitched together not by choice, but by the quiet recognition that survival was easier when not faced alone. There were those who tended the lamps, those who rose before dawn to grind the grain, those who bathed the children of their masters, and those who worked in silence, unseen, writing letters they could not sign. Each learned the moods of the house, the creak of the stairs before footsteps appeared, the pause before a command, the safe moments between orders. In those intervals, there were whispers, jokes, small conspiracies of comfort, a few stolen olives shared between friends, a scrap of cloth passed to patch a tunic, a secret kept when someone broke a rule. And sometimes something deeper. Love was not forbidden among slaves, though it was rarely safe. Couples formed quietly, their affection hidden between chores, their words whispered behind closed shutters. They could not marry, not in the eyes of Roman law. Their unions were called contubernium, a word that means sharing a tent. It was the same term used for soldiers. A fitting phrase, perhaps, for those who shared a long campaign of endurance. Children born of such unions belong not to their parents, but to the master. Yet still, they were loved fiercely, protected fiercely, as any children anywhere are. In letters and epitaphs, there are glimpses of these bonds, touching fragments that survive the centuries. A tombstone might read, "To my beloved fellow slave, taken too soon," or, "She was as a sister to me." Some households allowed these attachments, recognizing that affection made slaves more stable, less likely to flee or despair. Others forbade them. believing that love divided loyalty. But no law, no decree, can fully silence the human need to belong. In the countryside, where hundreds of slaves might work on vast estates, solidarity became a quiet weapon. A master might command obedience, but in the fields under the sun, the enslaved commanded understanding, a shared rhythm, a shared endurance. They helped one another survive. They warned, subtly, of punishments coming. They buried the dead when no one else cared to. They remembered names. Even rebellion, rare, desperate, was born of those same invisible threads. When Spartacus led his army of the enslaved, he did not summon an ideology, but a memory that they had once stood side by side, that they could again. Yet most did not rebel. Most simply lived, day after day, finding fragments of gentleness where they could. In the grand Roman villas, slaves formed their own hierarchies, their own small societies. Older ones guided the young, teaching them how to read a master's mood, how to avoid the worst hours of wrath. They passed down not just skills, but wisdom, the kind that keeps a spirit alive when all else is owned. Some evenings, after the house quieted, they would gather near the kitchens or in courtyards. The air would smell of ashes and bread. Stories would be told, not of Rome, but of other lands, of the blue hills of Thrace, of the river valleys of Gaul, of temples in Egypt. Those stories were not rebellion. They were remembrance, a way to keep the world large, when their own had been made small. Sometimes, one slave might have charge over another, a trusted servant promoted to overseer, torn between compassion and fear of punishment. The Romans understood this tension well. They cultivated it. A divided servitude served control. But even so, some overseers used their place to protect others, softening the blows, slipping bread into an empty hand. And when sickness came, as it often did, in houses without warmth, in fields without shade, the enslaved cared for one another. They bound wounds, whispered prayers, covered the dying with cloth, and closed the eyes of those who would never see home again. In these small acts, they built a kind of freedom, not of law, but of spirit, a freedom to give and to grieve, to choose kindness, even when nothing else was theirs to choose. The masters noticed sometimes. They spoke of good slaves, of faithful servants, without understanding what faithfulness truly meant. Not loyalty to Rome, but loyalty to each other. Centuries later, when the marble crumbled, and the empire fell silent, these quiet bonds would outlast it. Not written in the histories of emperors, but in the invisible chain that connects every human heart, that ever endured and still reached out. And if you listen now, in the hush after a long day, in the hum of distant rain, you can almost hear them, the voices of those who found each other in the dark, who shared bread, laughter, and the courage to be human, when the world called them things. And in the distance, the hearth still glows faintly, its warmth trembling against the night. Masters who freed their slaves, and why? Freedom in Rome was a performance, a ritual shaped by power. And the people who held that power, the masters, used it with care, or with calculation, or sometimes with something almost like affection. To free a slave was not just an act of mercy. It was a statement, a gesture that could elevate the reputation of the giver, as much as it liberated the one who received. The Romans called it manumissio, the sending forth from the hand, a phrase that captures both ownership and release, both the hand that held and the one that let go. There were several ways to grant this release, each surrounded by ceremony, each reflecting the nature of the giver. Some freed their slaves publicly, before a magistrate in the open forum, under the gaze of witnesses. Others did it privately, in a quiet corner of the household, with a word and a nod, the way one might open a door. The simplest was manumissio inter amicos, freedom among friends. A master could declare before a small circle that this man or this woman would no longer serve. Sometimes the gesture came at the end of a long life of service. Sometimes it was a gift, for loyalty, for love, for the quiet devotion of years. There was also the vindicta, a ritual thick with symbolism. Before an official, the master would touch the slave with a rod, the vindicta, and declare them free. It was a symbolic contest of ownership, and the slave, for that brief moment, was both property and person, held between two worlds. And finally, there was freedom by will, testamento, granted after death, a last kindness, or a final balancing of accounts. Many Romans, as they aged, felt the weight of their lives press upon them. The empire thrived on order, but death, inevitable and leveling, reminded even the wealthy that control was brief. To free one's slaves upon death was a way of releasing one's own burdens, a last offering to the gods and to conscience. In the will of Pliny the Younger, we find mention of such gestures. He speaks of freeing those who had served him faithfully, and of leaving them small inheritances besides. Pliny was, by Roman standards, a gentle man. But even his kindness was framed in hierarchy, a benevolence that reminded everyone who had possessed the power to grant it. Other masters freed slaves to secure loyalty that would outlive them. A freedman, after all, owed obligations to his former owner, now his patronus. He would continue to assist, advise, or serve, but now with the dignity of a citizen. In this way, freedom became a tool, a softer chain, more durable than iron. Inscriptions from Roman tombs show this duality clearly. One reads, Marcus freed his slave, Hermia, who served him with loyalty and love, made her gratitude endure as long as his name. Another, more businesslike, simply says, freed under condition of continued service. But not all manumissions were so formal. In some houses, affection blurred the lines of ownership. A nurse who had raised her master's children, a tutor who had educated generations, a concubine who had shared her master's bed for decades. These were people whose lives had twined too closely to be dismissed without a trace. When freedom came, it often came quietly. A key handed over, a word spoken after dinner, a document sealed and left on a table. For the freed, it was both an ending and a beginning. They stepped out into a world where they could finally call themselves liberti. Free, but marked by what they had been. Many stayed close to the houses they had served, not out of fear, but because the known world, the walls, the courtyards, the familiar smells, had become home. In Rome, whole neighborhoods were filled with freedmen, craftsmen, shopkeepers, bakers, barbers. They built tombs not of grand marble, but of humble stone, inscribed with the names they had chosen for themselves, names that combined their former masters with their own. Half gratitude, half declaration. One epitaph, found near Pompeii, reads with a kind of quiet triumph, Lucius freed me. Now I am Lucius too. It was not equality, not yet, but it was voice. Some freedmen rose high. They became secretaries to emperors, treasurers, administrators. The invisible machinery of Rome. Under Augustus, several freedmen managed the empire's finances. A subtle irony. That men once sold in markets now balanced the gold of the world's greatest power. Others became patrons themselves, buying and freeing slaves of their own. The cycle turned again. Oppressor and oppressed now joined in the strange inheritance of empire. Not all freedom was granted from kindness. Some masters freed slaves simply to avoid responsibility, to lighten the burden of feeding or housing the old. Others did it for profit, charging the slave to buy their release through peculium. Freedom, even then, came at a cost. But whatever the motive, the act carried meaning. In that moment of release, whether sincere or self-serving, the line between ownership and personhood blurred, and something human flickered through. For some, freedom brought unease. A slave, long conditioned to obedience, might find liberty disorienting. There are letters from former slaves, asking advice on how to live, how to make decisions without command. Freedom, for them, was a kind of silence. Too wide, too unfamiliar. Others embraced it fully. They dressed as citizens, spoke boldly in markets, and took pride in their names. They celebrated Dies Natalis Libertatis, the birthday of their freedom, each year with food, song, and prayer. In the temples of Rome, freedmen made offerings to Libertas, the goddess of freedom, whose statue once stood on the Aventine hill, her torch raised to the sky. One can imagine them there, men and women of every color, every accent, kneeling before the flame, their faces lit in gold light, their lips moving not in Latin, but in whatever language they still dreamed in. And perhaps, as the torches flickered, they thought not only of themselves, but of those who remained behind, still sleeping on the hard floors of the villa, still waking at the sound of orders. For freedom in Rome was never only personal. It was a thread, fragile but shining, passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation. Some caught it. Others only saw it glint far away, like sunlight on the Tiber. And as night fell over the city, the freed and the enslaved alike returned to their homes, some to their own beds, some to the corners of another's house. But above them all, the same quiet stars kept watch, their light indifferent, eternal, and soft. And in the distance, somewhere near the Aventine, a lamp burned late, and the air smelled faintly of olive oil and hope. Domestic intimacies and unspoken rules. Not all the power in Rome was loud. Some of it whispered. It breathed between curtains, hid in the folds of linen, and lived in the quiet moments that no law could touch. Within the villa, the boundaries of command and familiarity were never as firm as marble suggested. A Roman household was not merely a structure of brick and order. It was a living organism, pulsing with routine, with small kindnesses, with small cruelties, with gestures that carried both duty and longing. There were rules, of course. A slave might not dine beside their master. They were not to speak unless spoken to, nor to look directly into certain eyes. But in practice, the walls between people thinned with time. A nurse might soothe her master's child to sleep, singing the same lullaby she once sang to her own child far away, the one she would never see again. A cook might taste before serving, testing for poison or salt, and in that moment, risking her life for another's comfort. Some masters treated their slaves as part of the household in every sense, scolding, rewarding, teasing, and in rare cases, confiding. It was a world where affection and ownership entangled themselves like ivy on stone. Roman letters tell of trusted slaves who held their master's secrets, carried private letters, and even advised in matters of love. The poet Martial once mocked a senator for trusting his slave more than his wife. And yet, between laughter and insult, the truth was clear. Trust in a house built on power was always a dangerous luxury. There were slaves who shared their masters' beds, sometimes by force, sometimes by weary consent, and sometimes by something that resembled closeness. Roman writers called them concubinae, a word that balanced precariously between mistress and servant. They were not wives, but they were not strangers either. In the letters of Cicero and the writings of Pliny, we glimpse these entanglements. A free woman named Antonia wrote bitterly of her former master, saying that though he had granted her freedom, he still owned her heart. And so, even liberty could carry its own leash. In some villas, generations of servants grew up beside the family they served. They knew the moods of their masters better than anyone. Which wine he preferred, which sandals she wore to the garden, when the child was likely to cry. In return, the masters often knew their names, their tempers, their laughter. It was a mutual knowing, but not a mutual life. A master might call a slave faithful, beloved, or good soul, but beneath those words lay the reminder: beloved, but not equal; faithful, but not free. Sometimes, in moments of quiet, a different kind of tenderness flickered through. Letters from freedmen to their former owners show gratitude that feels almost intimate. One writes, "You treated me not as a slave, but as a companion. May the gods keep you as I would keep you, if the world allowed." Such words were rare, but not impossible. In the inner rooms of Roman villas, those spaces known as cubiculum and culina, the sleeping chamber and the kitchen, life breathed softly. The cook stirred a pot of lentils. The linen slave folded togas still warm from the sun. The steward counted jars of oil by lamplight. They spoke in low voices, laughed when the masters could not hear. And in those whispers, the world was briefly, quietly theirs. For the slaves who worked inside the home, there was always the paradox of nearness. They were closer to luxury than most Romans ever saw. Fine fabrics, imported oils, silver plates. Yet none of it was theirs to touch freely. A mistake could cost a backhand. Or worse, a broken goblet, a misplaced word, a glance at the wrong moment. Everything was measured. Still, many masters found themselves relying on the same people they claimed to own. A noblewoman's hairdresser, for instance, was often her confidant. She heard the gossip, saw the tears, and knew which locks of hair were twisted in anxiety. Roman satire writers loved to joke that the slaves knew everything: the lovers' names, the household debts, the whispered schemes of senators. But beneath the laughter was unease. For if slaves knew everything, they also carried power. A silent power. One that could neither be punished nor ignored. Trust was always conditional. But it was there nonetheless, threaded through the daily rhythm, like gold through linen. A slave might bring the master's sandals, and for a brief second, their eyes would meet, not as equals, but as two people sharing a small, fragile moment in the vast machinery of empire. And in that flicker, something like understanding could pass between them. Unspoken, unacknowledged, but real. There were rituals to maintain the illusion of distance. Slaves greeted their masters with bowed heads. They called them dominus or domina, even when speaking softly. At meals, they stood behind the diners, hands folded, waiting for a gesture. But when the guests had gone, and the house grew quiet, the boundaries softened. A trusted servant might pour a little extra wine, sit for a while by the dying embers, and talk about the weather, or the crops, or the dogs. And in that dim light, as cicadas sang outside and oil lamps sputtered, the villa felt less like a fortress of hierarchy, and more like a single, breathing home. Roman moralists, of course, disliked this softness. They warned masters against too much familiarity, too much warmth. Remember, one wrote, that they are tools, not companions. But the human heart rarely obeys philosophy. In the long hush between sunset and dawn, affection crept in through the cracks. A master might check on a sick servant, and leave a coin for medicine. A servant might tuck a sleeping child's blanket tighter, and neither would speak of it in daylight. It was not equality, but it was something human. These were the unspoken rules. Rules of glances and gestures, of small mercies that made a hard life bearable. And when night fell fully, the villa exhaled. The slaves lay down on straw mats or wooden benches, the masters on softer couches, but all under the same roof, under the same sky, listening to the same soft rustle of wind in the olive trees. And somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then twice, and silence settled again. Thick, gentle, and deep as sleep. Punishments, fears, and quiet resistance. Even in a house filled with small mercies, the shadow of fear was never far. Roman slavery, like the empire itself, was built on structure, on law, and on the constant reminder that one person could command another's life. Punishment was part of this rhythm. It came in many forms: a sharp word, a sudden strike, or in more formal cases, a rod or a chain. Some masters used it sparingly, others without hesitation, yet always with calculation. Rome prized order above all, and cruelty was tolerated only insofar as it did not disturb the household or society. The law acknowledged this. By the 1st century AD, emperors like Hadrian had begun to curb the most extreme excesses. A master who killed a slave without reason could face consequences, not because the act was morally wrong, but because it was wasteful. The state depended on labor, and property could not vanish without cause. Even so, fear was a constant companion. A field hand might walk a mile in silence, glancing over the shoulder, knowing the overseer's eyes followed every movement. A house slave might hesitate at a tray, fearing that a spill could bring more than a scolding. A glance at a master's face could shift the day's mood entirely. And yet, within these constraints, resistance quietly endured. It was subtle, often invisible, hidden in ordinary acts of survival. Some resisted through humor. A joke at the right time, whispered to another, could lift spirits without ever reaching the master's ears. Some resisted through delay, working slowly, prolonging the labor, making time itself a subtle challenge to authority. Others resisted through memory, remembering a homeland, a family, a past life, or whispering those memories to friends. Was a refusal to be fully claimed. It was a quiet assertion that, even bound by chains, they remained human. There were also acts of clever disobedience. A loaf of bread might be saved for later. A letter might be hidden or misdelivered. A tunic might be patched imperfectly, or a task left slightly undone. These small gestures were often invisible to the masters, but they maintained a sense of self. Punishments, though feared, were also instructive. They reinforced the hierarchy. But they also revealed the limits of power. A master could strike, punish, or scold. But he could not remove memory, imagination, or loyalty between slaves. Even escape was an act of resistance. Though dangerous, risky, and often tragic, slaves sometimes ran, to another household, to the countryside, or even to the distant provinces beyond Rome's immediate gaze. Fugitives reminded everyone of a fundamental truth. Chains may bind the body, but not the mind entirely. The literature of the time, letters, speeches, satires, suggests a complicated understanding of punishment. Cicero, for instance, mentions slaves who were mistreated but continued to serve faithfully. It was not obedience born of joy, but of survival and calculation. Even those who submitted, at least outwardly, often carried private indignation or subtle defiance. Religious rituals, too, offered both control and comfort. Slaves might pray to household gods, the Laras and Penates, or to gods of protection such as Mercury or Fortuna. These prayers were quiet acts, often unseen, invoking help not from the master, but from powers beyond his reach. In households where cruelty was extreme, resistance could take the form of passive rebellion. Spoiled food might be served to animals, tools might be hidden, or doors left ajar. Each small act, unnoticed, kept the spirit alive. Some slaves, entrusted with delicate tasks, used their positions to shield others. A kitchen slave might slip extra bread to a child. A steward might cover for a coworker's mistakes. Even minor acts could ripple outward, changing the texture of life within the house. Stories of larger revolts, like that of Spartacus, loom over the history of Roman slavery. But they were rare, exceptional eruptions of desperate courage. More common were these quiet resistances, persistent and patient, threaded through daily life like fine silk and coarse wool. And always, fear and resistance coexisted. A slave might fear the lash while nurturing a secret hope. They might obey today, and plan quietly for tomorrow. Even in the darkest corners, the human mind found a way to assert itself. Some masters noticed these subtleties, sometimes rewarding compliance, sometimes punishing cleverness. But the invisible bonds between the enslaved, the whispers, the memories, the shared glances, remained out of reach. These bonds became a quiet, living history, a story of endurance beyond laws and rods. And in the small hours of the night, as the villa lay silent except for the distant barking of dogs, or the creak of the wind in the olive trees, one could imagine these silent resistances continuing. Coins counted slowly in hidden pockets, bread shared quietly among friends, a whispered name, a remembered river, a fleeting dream of freedom. Life persisted. Hope persisted. And in the darkness, the air smelled faintly of ash, warm stone, and oil lamps flickering in the corners. And somewhere, far off, a gentle stream murmured over smooth stones, as if echoing the quiet courage of those who lived in shadow, and yet, somehow, refused to be entirely tamed. The long echo, how Rome's slavery shaped the future. History moves slowly, like water over stone. And the life of Rome, with all its grandeur and cruelty, leaves ripples that stretch far beyond the city's 7 hills. The slaves of Rome, though bound and often silenced, shaped the empire in ways both visible and subtle. They tilled the fields. They stirred the kitchens. They built roads and temples. They carried messages and coins. And in doing so, they carried the empire forward, even as the chains held them still. The echoes of their labor lingered in stone and mortar. The arches of aqueducts, the foundations of villas, the long straight roads stretching to the provinces, all bear witness to hands that were owned but skilled, hands that measured, cut, and lifted, hands that left marks invisible to the law, but indelible in the world itself. Freedmen, too, shaped the future. Many became traders, craftsmen, teachers, the silent engine of Rome's economy. They transmitted skills learned in servitude, metalwork, weaving, literacy, account-keeping, to the next generation, to their children, to others who had once been enslaved, through marriage and family, through neighborhoods of freedmen, and through small, quiet acts of remembrance. Slaves and freedmen wove themselves into the fabric of Roman society. Their influence, subtle and patient, shifted the rhythms of daily life. Even when the empire seemed focused only on conquest and display. In the villas and towns, one can still imagine the small details of their lives lingering. A hand smoothing a child's hair. A pot left to simmer just long enough. A whispered warning of approaching anger. These were gestures that shaped the rhythm of existence. That shaped what Rome felt like, day to day, for those who dwelled within its walls. Legal reforms, too, bear witness to their impact. Over centuries, the treatment of slaves slowly evolved. Under the Julio-Claudian emperors, certain protections were introduced. By Hadrian's time, some rights were formalized. A slave could not be killed without cause, and manumission became more common and regulated. These changes, small and incremental, reflect a society learning, slowly, that the lives of slaves mattered to the order of the state. The imagination of later generations preserved the memory of these lives, though often through the lens of literature and moralizing. Historians, poets, and satirists wrote of slaves' cunning, of their endurance, of their clever subversions of power. Even in humor or criticism, the humanity of the enslaved shone through. And yet, one can imagine the countless stories lost. The quiet lives of those who never saw freedom, who labored in obscurity, whose names were never carved in stone. They remained part of Rome, like faint echoes beneath the stones, like the soft sigh of wind through olive trees. The empire fell, as all empires do. But the lessons endured. The bonds formed in servitude. The small resistances. The brief flashes of autonomy. All left traces in the societies that followed. In the Middle Ages, the concept of servitude persisted, shaped in part by the patterns established in Rome. The households, the laws, the subtle negotiations of power. All echoes of Roman precedent. And even today, historians can trace the threads. In law, in language, in culture. Reminders that the lives of those who served shaped the future, as much as the lives of those who commanded. As we consider Rome, we might imagine the silence between the marble columns, the quiet spaces where slaves whispered, laughed softly, mourned privately, and dared to dream. They walked the same streets as senators and soldiers, saw the same temples, touched the same stone. They were invisible in law, but present in life, moving beneath the surface, shaping the world in ways that will never be fully recorded, but can be imagined softly, gently, in the mind's eye. And as night falls, as the sun dips behind the hills of the Tiber, one can picture a villa at dusk. The masters have dined, the lamps are lit. The wind moves through the olive groves. And somewhere in a corner, a slave counts coins, mends cloth, or whispers a story to a friend. Freedom may come, or it may not. Yet the human heart endures, quietly, persistently. Rome may crumble, Empires may rise and fall, but the traces of those who lived under the weight of chains remain in the soft details of life, in the rhythm of daily labor, and in the whisper of memory that drifts like incense through the long corridors of history. And as the night deepens, the villa sleeps. The wind brushes against the walls. The distant river murmurs. And somewhere softly, a candle flickers, echoing the enduring presence of lives that once labored, and yet, somehow, never entirely vanished. Gentle wrap-up. And now, dear listener, let us leave the streets of Rome and its quiet households behind, carrying with us only the soft rhythms of life, the whispers between those bound and those free, the rustle of olive leaves, the faint glow of lamplight on stone walls. May your thoughts drift as gently as the Tiber flows, carrying you toward rest. Your mind may wander through the courtyard, feel the warmth of embers in a hearth, or the soft shuffle of footsteps in a sleeping villa. All is calm. All is still. Let history become a lullaby. Its stories like gentle waves, washing over you. And as you close your eyes, may the past wrap around you softly, and may your dreams be as quiet, as patient, and as enduring as the lives of those who shaped Rome from within. Sleep now and rest well.